It happens all the time in the biz. A popular film puts out a popular sequel, and then, when it comes time to release another entry in what is now a full-blown franchise, the third film craps the bed. A lot of theories abound to explain the cursed thirds, such as heightened expectations, studios getting more involved, and overall creative burnout. And even franchises that survive to make a fourth film often resort to dramatic changes in tone or style to make it through their number threes. I'm not saying all third entries are cursed, there have been notable exceptions, nor am I saying all third movies are bad. I like some of the movies I'm showing you right now, others not so much. But there's no denying that the thirds are a major stumbling block, and perhaps there is no greater example of this than the subject of today's video. A movie that stretches not only the definition of science fiction, but also of classic.
And all I can say is, thank the Lord for Superman!
After computer programmer Gus Gorman makes a code that embezzles $85,000 from his company, the head of the corporation, Ross Webster, hires him to commit various acts of industrial sabotage. When Superman starts to thwart Webster's evil plans, Gorman hands him a chunk of synthetic kryptonite that begins to corrupt the Man of Steel. With the world's greatest superhero no longer in the way, Webster builds a massive computer with hopes of using it to take over Metropolis and the world. Before I get started, a quick disclaimer. A lot of behind-the-scenes information about this film is subject to debate and controversy. One of my sources, for example, is an audio commentary track from Ilya Salkind and Pierre Spengler, the producers, and as much as I praised them for bringing Superman to life the first time, I have to admit I don't trust them to tell the whole truth about their films. That commentary track is probably the most hostile and self-inflating defense of a film I've ever heard, and I've heard Shatner defend Star Trek V.
I don't want my pain taken away, I need my pain!
Therefore, take a lot of this with a spoonful of salt, and remember that in this business, it is virtually impossible to know what really happened behind the scenes unless you were there, and even then, get a second opinion. So keep all that in mind as we get into this. In May of 1980, the year before Superman 2's wide release, the Salkinds flew banners over the Cannes Film Festival touting the strength of their new super-powered movie franchise, with one banner proudly announcing that Superman 3 was already in pre-production. Ilya even said in interviews that it had an operating budget of $30 to $35 million. Without calling any of this an outright lie, it is at the very least a major exaggeration. To be fair, Superman 3 was being seriously discussed even before Superman 2 was finished filming. Before he was fired, director Richard Donner had plans to have Tom Mankiewicz write a script in which Brainiac would serve as the central villain. Of course, as you should know from my Superman 2 video, Donner didn't make it to the finish line of that movie, and Mankiewicz walked away from the franchise in solidarity. Then, in December of 1980, Ilya Salkind wrote a brief story outline that also had Brainiac as the main villain, now with Mr. Mxyzptlk serving as a secondary villain, possibly to be played by Dudley Moore. This outline is available online and is a quick read, but fair warning, it's completely insane, because it includes time travel, dimensional travel, and a romantic relationship with Supergirl. Maybe I'll dedicate one of my weekly live streams to talking about it. Regardless, this was quickly rejected for being too complicated and expensive, and so, after briefly considering selling the rights to Dino De Laurentiis, the producers had to come up with another idea. In May of 1981, while the Salkinds were flying another misleading banner over Cannes that claimed Superman 3 was already in production, the comedian Richard Pryor, arguably at the height of his mainstream popularity, went on The Tonight Show to promote his movie Bustin' Loose. At one point during the show, he briefly showed childlike excitement for Superman 2.
We've seen the dick. Yeah, it's true!
and a couple of months later, he was telling interviewers that he'd love to be in a Superman movie. Thus, the Salkinds and their writers, David and Leslie Newman, got it into their heads to put Richard Pryor in Superman 3. When negotiations with Pryor began in earnest shortly thereafter, the script took shape as a more comedic take on the property, with director Richard Lester, returning from his takeover duties on Superman 2, getting a chance to show off his extensive background as a comedic filmmaker. Though most of Ilias Salkind's story concepts had been nixed, the ideas of Superman turning bad and of there being an evil supercomputer were still retained. Christopher Reeve, who obviously played Superman, was contracted for a total of 7 Superman films, but with the help of a lawyer, who happened to also be Richard Donner's lawyer, he was able to renegotiate for an undisclosed sum prior to Superman 3. There has been a long-standing rumor that before the new deal was struck, television actor Tony Danza was cast to play Superman, but by all accounts, that never happened. Probably the biggest source of contention comes from Gene Hackman and Margot Kidder as Lex Luthor and Lois Lane, respectively. Hackman had publicly fallen out with the Salkinds over their treatment of Donner, and allegedly refused to appear in more Superman films as long as they were involved, and Kidder accused the Salkinds and Spangler of being quote-unquote despicable people whom she had nothing but contempt for. She briefly thought she was fired for these statements, but unlike Hackman, who later cited mere scheduling conflicts as being the real reason he didn't return, Kidder was brought back for Superman 3, though her role was significantly reduced to only 2 bookending scenes. The Salkinds and Spangler deny that her public statements had anything to do with Lois Lane's bizarre absence for most of the film, claiming that they thought her romantic arc with Superman was played out, and they wanted to instead focus on Lana Lang. I'm not going to tell you what to believe here, but I know which explanation seems more plausible to me. As for Lana Lang, who had briefly appeared alongside high school footballer Brad Wilson in the original film, the Newmans wrote the part specifically for Annette O'Toole, who would later play Martha Kent in Smallville. Brad is played in Superman 3 by Gavin O'Herlihy, son of the great Dan O'Herlihy. The Newmans also created the character of Gus Gorman with Richard Pryor in mind, giving the actor plenty of opportunities to improv and do comedic impressions. For the main villain, the evil mega-corporate industrialist Ross Webster, they seriously considered Frank Langella, who at the time was considered more of a stage actor, but who had broken into film notoriety for playing Dracula a few years earlier. However, the role went to Robert Vaughn, who was considered more of a draw due to his popularity following The Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Magnificent Seven, and Bullet. On this channel, he is also known as the voice of the evil supercomputer Proteus in Demon Seed.
I'm going to bypass your forebrain and appeal directly to your amygdala.
In addition to Jackie Cooper and Mark McClure reprising their roles as Perry White and Jimmy Olsen, Aaron Smolinski, the young boy who played Baby Superman in the first film, has a brief cameo as the kid at the photo booth. Other notable actors include Not the 9 O'Clock News' Pamela Stevenson as Lorelei Ambrosia, probably my favorite character in the whole movie, jazz songbird Annie Ross as Vera Webster, and Shane Rimmer in a tiny role as this random police officer. Principal photography began in June of 1982, mostly at Pinewood Studios in London, but with some location shooting done in Alberta and Calgary, with some second unit work filmed at Utah's Glen Canyon. The coal quarry was filmed at the disused Battersea Power Station alongside the Thames, and the 007 stage was used for the climactic supercomputer cave, as well as Webster's skyscraper-topping ski slope. Incidentally, that's not snow or even artificial snow, it's actually Epsom salt. The effects teams were largely the same from the previous films, with Roy Field doing the optical visual effects, Colin Childers doing the physical special effects, and Derek Meddings building the miniatures. They also continued refining the front-projected Zoptic process for the flying sequences, along with better wire work and some truly impressive stunt work. I feel the need to give particular kudos to Christopher Reeve's stunt double, Vic Armstrong, who had a lot to do during the Superman vs. Clark Kent battle, which most people agree is the best part of the whole film. Superman 3 released in the summer of 1983, to reviews that were mixed at best, criticizing the film for leaning much harder on the comedy to the point of self-parody. However, though it did make less at the box office than its predecessors, it still turned a modest profit with its roughly $80 million worldwide gross. In the years since its release, general opinion has sided mostly with the critics, and Superman 3 is considered the point at which the Christopher Reeve-led franchise ran into a brick wall. There was another film released in its wake, 2 if you count Supergirl, but that was more of a final nail than anything else. So here's the point where I try to defend Superman 3. I grew up with this movie, and yes, the Vera assimilation scene did traumatize me along with the rest of my generation, and I will say that, as a kid, I really liked it. I even liked it more than I did the first two, mostly because as a kid I thought the first one was boring and the second one was too dark. Physically dark, I mean, not thematically. My VHS copy of Superman 2 must have been a bad transfer or something. I've also always been a fan of Richard Pryor, going back to well before I fully understood much of what he said in his comedy routines. I used to watch Superman 3 as a double feature with The Toy, another favorite of mine.
Stop the Wonder Wheel! Help!
And I think that's the thing. As a kid, I thought of this more as a Richard Pryor movie than as a Superman movie. It's an easier movie to appreciate from that perspective because, say what you will about the movie, but Pryor is having a blast doing what he does best. But I get it. Of course I do. As a Superman movie, I can't deny this was a cursed third that killed the movie franchise. It is a comedy above all else, to the detriment of its more serious potential themes or entertaining action sequences. From the very start, with the slapstick Rube Goldberg chaos of the Metropolis streets, to the end, with the Daily Planet crew watching a lottery machine explode in Perry White's office, it refuses to take anything seriously or reflect on how the characters have developed over the course of the last two movies. In effect, it's worse than a filler episode. As the critics said, it feels like it's making fun of the franchise, not moving it in a better direction. From a narrative perspective, it's also a terrible mess. Setting aside Lois Lane's painful absence and the fact that Robert Vaughn is just playing a more generic version of Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor, the actual mechanics of the story aren't cohesive and rely on a lot of absurd coincidences. Consider the fact that at the end of the movie, nobody seems to know why Superman turned evil for a few days, and nobody has connected the Colombian weather events, the oil conspiracy, or anything else to Webster or Gus. This isn't an original thought of mine, but this is where Lois would have been narratively useful, because she could be putting the pieces together the whole time. Instead, the movie only has Superman going to the final fight because the villains stupidly tell him where to go, not because he's actually figured anything out. And as awesome as the junkyard fight is, and it is awesome, can we all admit that it doesn't really make much sense? It's frustrating because the core idea of early 80s computer paranoia could definitely work, and Superman turning evil is a much more interesting plot development than having him chained down by kryptonite again. Honestly, and without giving Ilya Salkind too much credit, they should have kept Brainiac as the villain, and they should have had him use the supercomputer to turn Superman evil rather than using synthetic kryptonite. They could have even kept Richard Pryor and had him be funny, albeit maybe they should have given him less screen time, and they didn't need to include all the random craziness of Salkind's original outline. Unfortunately, the decision to turn the whole movie into a farce is what did it in, and whether it's fair or not, a lot of the blame has fallen on Pryor and Lester. I'd rather blame the Newmans and the Salkinds, but that's beside the point. Outside of how it inspired the cinematic masterpiece that is Office Space...
This sounds familiar.
Yeah, they did in Superman 3.
Right.
The only other positive thing I want to say about Superman 3 is I actually like the inclusion of Lana Lang, and I think Annette O'Toole is absolutely adorable. It would have been better if there were actual tension with Lois Lane, but I like that Lana is more in love with Clark Kent, while Lois is more in love with Superman. That's an interesting dynamic that could have been explored a lot more. Anyway, I've gone on long enough. Suffice it to say, I still like Superman 3, warts and all, and when I inevitably get around to covering Superman 4, we can all appreciate how much more of a sci-fi classic the third movie is, as opposed to the fourth. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Are you able to appreciate Superman 3? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to smash those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll explore dystopian skin art, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.